Hello YouTube, it's Lion here with Hobbies of a Man once again, and today I'm bringing you something a little slightly different. We're going to do an original English light novel review today. We're going to review Lord of Goblins, which is a brand new book that came out recently. For transparency's sake, this was sent to me in exchange for an honest review. I received it July 2nd. I read it July 3rd, 4th, and I finished it this morning on July 5th. So it took me about 3 days, but I didn't read consistently. And I think it only took me around 4 hours to read the whole thing. It's only 220 pages. It's written by Michael Werbruck and by Hadi Y. Bendaki. I don't know how to say that, I'm sorry. And the illustrations are provided by Darkness Studio. It's published by Moonquill, which is a web novel website, if I understand correctly. I'm not exactly sure. And the genres here are isekai. I would call it dark fantasy, but the one of the authors that was talking to me said that it was just fantasy and it has elements of sci-fi, so that's what I'm going to go with. But I personally would qualify it as dark fantasy. It obviously has no adaptation since it's been only now released. And the premise here is that a soldier turned politician dies, gets isekai'd into this goblin world, and now is a lowly slave. And so he has to use his knowledge and cunning to kind of climb to freedom, more or less. But before we get into the evaluation, I do want to talk about how the book itself, like the physical thing, compares to a few other light novels, okay? So for comparison, this is the book that I got, and this is a yen press book, so it's obviously slightly taller. This is how the sides look. We have the logo for the company up here. Besides that, I think that this is a very comparable book to a yen press release. It's a little stiffer. The stock at the outside feels a little tougher, and the paper is slightly thicker, and it has a very smooth surface. It doesn't have any texture to it, and that's kind of it. There's a few, not problems, but things I noticed. For one, there's a lot of blank pages at the end. I see, they don't serve any purpose. There's also a blank page at the beginning, and then the image, which needs to be cropped better. It's a little too cropped up here and not cropped enough down here. So it was shifted up a little bit. The title page is on the inside instead of out here. So I think these probably should be switched, since this is the copyright information. The synopsis, I feel, should have its own page, and then the table of contents as well. And then we have a blank page, and then the beginning of the novel, which features a nice drawing. The other thing is the margins are really small, as you can see right there, and they're really large down here, so there's a lot of blank space usually at the bottom of the pages. Here, I'll flip through the middle of the book so you guys can see. So I think this could have actually done with being a slightly smaller size, or at least have the pages centered lower so that you would have a better margin at the top and the bottom. But I think this is like a very new process for this company and for the authors, sorry. So I understand that there are going to be some complications. Other than that, the text was good. The images are nicely placed. There's some times where I feel like it would have been better if the chapters all started on the right hand, on what would be the right hand side if you're reading, because it's a little weird to start chapters randomly on the left. At least in most books, most chapters start on the right. But that's basically it. Overall, it's a good quality product. There's nothing wrong with it specifically. It's just kind of like not following the conventions that are usual, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a little difference that I noticed. But yeah, now really getting into the evaluation of the book. It's not the best thing ever by any means, but I think it's definitely above average. It's a good start, and I am happy to have gotten the opportunity to read it because I am actually excited to see what comes next. But there are a few kinks here that should probably be worked out. And it might actually come from the fact that it's a pair of writers that are writing this instead of an individual. Yeah, anyway. So we're going to review this in five parts like we usually do. the plot line, the characters, the world building, the art, the fan service, and I'll give you my rating at the end, and I'll mention anything that I forgot to mention beforehand, and then I'll give you my recommendation and titles that I find similar. So the plot line here is really good, actually, but only when we're dealing with the Goblin world. When we're dealing with the stuff that the main character went through when he was a human, while interesting, kind of loses you, right? Because you're reading this and you're like deep in this lore of this Goblin world, and you're understanding what's going on and the politics, the intrigue, everything about the Goblin world. And then you have a random chapter, which is essentially a flashback to the main character's life. Although it's interesting, I don't really feel like it adds anything. In fact, I feel like it just detracts a little bit. What is told to us is interesting. It's a very interesting sci-fi, dystopian, like postmodern world where people are no longer valued except as things to throw at other countries, as fodder for cannons, you know. So it's interesting and it's, you know, meaningful, but I think it would have worked better as a prequel or as a separate book than as inserts in this one. Because if it would have been like, okay, this thing happened in the human world, and then you go back to the Goblin world, and it's kind of like a similar situation, and then you're like, oh, so this is what he's going to do in the future, which might have been what was being planned, but it never felt correct. It never felt like it landed. So usually when we went to the human world, it's like, okay, there's this bunch of interesting information, but that's not relevant to what's going on in the Goblin world. So that's kind of my take here. But the actual Goblin world situation was really interesting. It was straightforward. We're at the bottom, and even though I'm physically weaker than everyone else, my cunning allows me to overcome those problems. And, you know, this is from the main character's perspective. And so what he does is build up his reputation and then help other weak goblins to develop military skills, military precision, command, order, essentially, and have enough training that they can react without necessarily having to think about it. And then there's political intrigue between the different gangs of goblins that exist and between the different races of goblins. So it was really interesting. It's just there was a little bit of miscommunication, a little bit of disconnect when we have to jump back and forth between the two worlds. But it is an interesting concept. I just think the execution was not the best, okay? It wasn't necessarily bad. It just wasn't exactly like good, I guess. But that's it for the plot line. Now the characters are also pretty interesting. We have our main character who goes by Lev. So his name is Leonard Aaron Vandersteen. His nickname Lev is the L from Leonard, the E from Aaron, and the V from Vandersteen. But we don't get told that. We just kind of have to infer it, which is fair, but like you should have told us that that's his nickname instead of just like make us realize it on our own. It was a little confusing at the beginning. Although his goblin self is actually named Gurm. And he's like a broken but strong kind of, not necessarily idealist, but someone that wants something better. And he's going to do anything he has to in order to take it. So it's a really cool character. It's a lot more similar to a Western character archetype than an Eastern character archetype. So it's more akin to epic, to Western adult fantasy than it is, you know, light novels. But yeah, there are a few problems with this character, and it's that his interactions with people feel a little forced sometimes, and the things he does are a little too over the top. He has a tendency of going on soapbox speeches, which are supposed to be really emotional and really appealing, but the execution is a little too easy to see through. So you're just like, oh, what is this guy doing? Why is he being so extra? You know what I mean? It's a very, like, I get what was going to what the authors were going for. It just didn't necessarily land. So it's actually more of the dialogue being a little broken than necessarily the character. There's a few other interesting characters. The two that I really thought were the most interesting were Rak and Virga. which are two gang leaders from different goblin gangs where, well, they're actually bogies. Goblins is like the upper class race and the overall name of their species. But Gurm and most of the characters in this book are actually bogey goblins, or which are small gray-skinned goblins. And they're interesting, and the character dynamics are cool. Like, there's like political intrigue. There's these rough around the edges kind of guys that have respect for each other, even though they might hate each other. It's a very, gritty, interesting take, and it was overall good. And then world building is probably the best part. It was my favorite by far. It was very cool. The goblinoid world is very inspired. It's very interesting. It actually kind of reminds me of a lot of European folklore and history. Like, a lot of it is like based around different groups of European people, or at least that's kind of what it feels like. Like, there's this group of pink-skinned like religious zealots that are kind of going through, and they're destroying the religious temples and stuff of other goblins, and then rebuilding building things for their own religion with those same stones, or at least that's kind of what it sounded like to me. And that was like very reminiscent of Catholics and Christians. There was another group called Galas, which is kind of, to me, sounded like Gauls, like the French, like southern France. Like one of the group of barbarians that kind of had a big fight with the Romans. So there was a lot of stuff like that was very European history inspired, which I thought was really cool. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, the world that they kind of built was dangerous. It was magical. It was gritty. It had a lot of stuff going for it. There was these horrifying giant insects that came in different sizes and shapes and had different skills. And the goblins had to band together in huge numbers in order to even come close to beating a lot of these. And there was a lot of religion and mysticalness to the book, which I very much enjoyed. The IRL, like real life, pre-death kind of world, like our world essentially, was not so interesting. It was a very like basic, like Asia and Europe combined, and then it's now this big horrifying endless war, and people are just dying left and right, and you have to find a way to become important so you don't die. So it didn't feel very inspired, although it was interesting to kind of go through to an extent. But I would have definitely liked it for them to be kind of separate books. Yeah, there was a lot of politics in this, and sometimes they kind of fell flat, but usually it was very clear how things were going and kind of where. There was a few things with the world building that kind of weren't the best. There was a lot of times where it felt like the authors were trying to insert world building without you noticing, but because it wasn't very well done, you really did notice it. Like, there was one scene that I remember very clearly where they're trying to explain a measuring unit, a killig or a skillig, something like that. And the way that they try to make it happen is that one of the goblins mispronounces it, and then another one corrects them. And then the goblin launches into a spoken description of why they choose that and what it means. But it's like, why would they verbally say that to each other? They all live there. They don't have to have that explained to them. In fact, you already have a very easy way to give us all of this world building without it seeming intrusive, by the fact that you can have Lev think about these things in relation to, I picked it out of Gurm's brain, and now I understand what's happening around me. There's a lot more, there's a lot of easier ways to make it, to have a lot of this world building introduced without it feeling so on the nose. And I feel like they missed a little bit of an opportunity there, because that's kind of one of the beautiful things about isekai, is that the fact that you're making a reincarnation, you're making someone from a different world come into this new one, is that you can make them learn everything at the same time as the reader, And so you can really build the world without it seeming horrible, because it's part of the story that this character has to learn about these things. And then there was a lot of moments where characters were talking about one thing, and then it started to turn into an explanation of the religion. And it's like, okay, I get what you're going for, but they were talking about killing each other 3 seconds ago. Why are they talking about the enlightened one right now? Like, it didn't, there was a bit of a disconnect there. But overall, it was enjoyable. There was a few rough bits, but mostly it was a fun read. I am actually excited to see what happens next, where it goes from there. And hopefully, what I and what a few other reviewers that I know have a copy of this, let them know, kind of helps them work out a few of their kinks. Because I do think this story is worth telling, and I do want to know more about it. It's just a little rough around the edges still. But yeah, so now the art is actually good. It's very enjoyable. I'm not sure if they want me to show you the art, but I'm going to anyways, because I think it's necessary. So here's a little bit of the sci-fi style. This is the beginning of the book. It's not a spoiler because it's like literally the first page. This is very good. I like that how much motion you can see here. It's really nice. This is probably the best one. I would have liked this at the beginning or at the end. This would have been nice to have. But yeah, it was really good. I really like the style that they're going for. I think Darkness Studio really did a good job with the illustrations. And I would like to see some more of their work. A color page would have been nice. But I understand this is a first printing. It's not going to be all that great. You know what I'm saying? It won't be the best thing ever. It won't have the same high quality as the company that's been printing for years. So I understand why they kind of kept it simple. And fan service, there's none, like none at all. There are some elements of kind of talking about stuff. Like there's a character that's a harem guard, and there is part of the gritty realism, or like the grim darkness, the dark fantasy aspect, is that a lot of times there's mentions of rape and of turning into sex slaves and having to be prostitutes and stuff, which in a medieval world and something where you have to find a way to be able to afford food makes total sense. If you're kind of sensitive to that type of topic, it's going to be something that happens not very often, but it's going to be there. So just be aware. And yeah, my overall rating is a 3.5 out of 5. So I can't say it's the best thing. Okay, it's enjoyable to read. You're gonna have to deal with a few rough edges. It's almost a really good book, but it just falls a little flat because of the issues that I've mentioned. So yeah, 3.5 out of 5. This is a 7 out of 10. It's a definitely fair book, so I definitely recommend it. Now, similar titles, I can't really think of any. The authors, or specifically Michael told me that the closest manga that he can think of to this would be Re-Monster, I think, which is one of those titles where someone gets reincarnated into a goblin. I've never read the story, but I know some of the people have read it and that they enjoy it. But yeah, that's basically it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and please like and subscribe and comment down below. Thank you guys very much for watching. See you guys later.